Okay, so this week we are back on personality. I didn't do videos last week. The week before, very few of you watched the videos, and it didn't seem to affect the quiz scores. So I thought I'd try one more time to do a video, and we'll see how many of you watch it, and we'll go from there. So personality, quite based, simply this is who you are. And there's a ton of different theories on personality theory. You can take an entire class on this. So we're just going to go over a few pieces of this. So perhaps the most well-known, although not used as much anymore, is Freud and his psychoanalytic perspective. Freud's theory of personality is based on a few things. Childhood sexuality. Now this gets confused pretty easily. It's not about kids having sex. It's about a general sex drive. So Freud basically says that everything you do is motivated by a sex drive. That doesn't mean that's all you do is have sex, but everything that you do, if it's not having sex, it's that sex drive moved into a different type of area of your life. So it's that ultimate sex drive, that pleasure principle that motivates you to do anything in life. He also talks about the psychosexual stages, the oral stage, anal stage, and phallic stage. So take a look at that. Freud also is known for the idea of the unconscious, and he says that that's where the secret to our personalities rests. So the unconscious is not accessible to us. It's unconscious. And it's mostly what would be considered by society as unacceptable thoughts, wishes, desires, feelings, etc. So any sort of therapy that you need for Freud, you have to get at that unconscious. So how do you do that? Because I can't get at my own unconscious just by sitting here. So a few different things, free association, dream work, different ways to get to the unconscious. So he has this personality structure of the ego, the superego, and the id. The superego and the id are part of the unconscious mind. The id, this is known as the devil inside. So this is your unconscious psychic energy striving to satisfy your basic sexual and aggression needs. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have sex to do it, but there's some way that you've got to have that drive satisfied. This is the pleasure principle. I want this and I want it now. So it's kind of like when they say the devil inside, it's like the devil on your shoulder that says, I don't care how I get this, I just need to get this now. Instant gratification. So anytime you make any of those decisions, so I don't care, I just want this piece of cake right now, I don't care about the consequences. Or I just want to go out and party tonight, I really don't care about the consequences. That, Freud would say, is your id kicking in, trying to get that pleasure principle satisfied. So that's the id. The superego, this is kind of the angel on the other side. So this is the part of you that is the internalized values, norms, ideas, how you should behave. So it's that conscious, or that little angel. This is the part that balances the id. So the id's like, yeah, instant gratification, do this now. And the superego's like, no, you need to study, you've got a quiz tonight, or tomorrow, you know. So it's kind of that other side, striving for perfection. So if you have a weak superego, that means your id will take over, and you don't necessarily think about these values. You're much more in the moment in your decision making for instant gratification. A strong superego is going to be the opposite. These people usually have a lot of guilt, and they're constantly thinking about what is the most virtuous decision, not how can I get the most satisfaction. So as you can kind of see, the id and superego for Freud are constantly at war. So you have to have someone to kind of navigate that. That, he says, is the ego. So this is like the executive. This is kind of the part of your personality that's operating on this reality principle. You've got to satisfy those drives of the id, that I need pleasure. But you've got to do it in a realistic way. You can't just let the id go all out and do whatever you want at any point. So this is the ego kind of tries to navigate to get the needs met for that pleasure, but also to do it in a responsible way. Fixation, you can take a look at this, being overly orally fixated, anally fixated. Freud, again, is the basis of a lot of psychoanalysis, psychology in general. A lot of folks aren't straight Freudian anymore, but this is where a lot of stuff comes from, so you need to know it as a result. So take a look at the psychosexual stages and kind of what's involved in each. The Oedipus complex, you've heard about this. Happens during his phallic stage, which is 3 to 6, when a boy is seeking genital stimulation, and thus develops an unconscious sexual desire towards his mother and feelings of jealousy and hatred towards his father. He also then has castration anxiety, fearing his father, but he has to repress that fear of his father instead, so he learns to identify with his father. So for Freud, that's the how gender role identification is learned. And there's the story of Hans that you can read, and that's the basic of Freud's Oedipal complex. Defense mechanisms. These are super interesting. So defense mechanisms are a really good thing to begin with. Defense mechanisms are the way you survive. You learn these often at a very young age, and they are the coping techniques, the defense mechanisms that help you survive. The problem is that when you learn these defense mechanisms, you often keep using them even when your situation no longer requires them. That's when they get problematic. So this is the ego's way of reducing anxiety. Remember, the ego is balancing that id and superego by changing reality. So there's some way that you can cope with your situations. And again, you see this with someone, for example, who is being raped and will disassociate from her body. That's a defense mechanism. And in the moment, it allows her survival. However, if she continues to disassociate from her body 10 years later, that defense mechanism is now a problem. The basic sorts of defense mechanism: repression. So this is where you banish your anxiety-arousing thoughts. So anything that's causing you too much anxiety, you're able to remove yourself from it. If you have anxiety, oftentimes you don't repress enough. And again, these are neither good or bad, they're coping skills. So there are certain things that you might need to repress, for example, certain types of trauma that you've undergone. And again, it helps you live without having that anxiety. Regression, this is when someone retreats to an earlier state. So, and it's big and small examples. So you see when people get angry, sometimes they throw temper tantrums. Or the example on your PowerPoint, someone who's trying to impress his friends by acting tough, but then when he gets in a rough situation, calls his mom. So, again, not good or bad, just kind of moving back in stages in order to deal with certain things. Reaction formation is one of my favorites. This is that saying, "Thou dost protest too much." So the ego unconsciously switches unacceptable impulses into their opposite. So the perfect example of this is homophobia. You will see sometimes the people who are most outspoken against gays and lesbians are actually gay and lesbian themselves. So, for example, a lot of pastors, not all by any means, but there's always stories about pastors that are constantly preaching against homosexuality, and then they're found with a gay prostitute or something of the sort. So, or someone who's constantly fighting against pornography. Maybe it's because they actually have their own porn addiction. So this is to escape what you deem as wrong, you act out the opposite of it. So that's reaction formation. Projection, you know all this. This is when you disguise your own threatening impulses by attributing them to others. So one of the things people say, if you are constantly complaining about certain attributes in other people, it's probably a good sign that there's something in that attribute in yourself. So if you're constantly calling out other people who gossip, that may be because you are gossiping too much yourself. So projection. Rationalization, another good one. This is when you justify explanations in place of real, more threatening, unconscious reasons for your actions. So basically, you kind of make these alternate stories that rationalize what's happened. So after failing a test, instead of taking personal responsibility, you blame the professor for making it too hard or not letting you know ahead of time what was going to be on the test, something like that. So rationalization, again, happens often. And displacement. So this is when you have an impulse towards one thing that's inappropriate, so you shift it towards a more acceptable object. This is oftentimes when you see people kicking dogs. They get upset at their spouse and they kick their dogs. Not that it's appropriate to kick your dogs, I want to be clear about that. But in the moment, it seems more appropriate to kick your dog than to beat your wife, right? Road rage, the same thing. So not that taking out that anger on that other displaced object is right. I want to be clear about that. But you're not really upset at the dog. That's the point. You're displacing your anger. So it tells you something about that. So all of this unconscious stuff, what do we do? There are Rorschach tests and other tests that are designed to try and figure out what's going on in your unconscious. So your PowerPoint has a few different examples. So there's pictures, and psychiatrists may show you these pictures and ask you what you see, and based on what you see, the goal is that they will be able to gain access into what's going on with your unconscious. So you can take a look at that and some examples of the Rorschach test. Criticisms of these projective tests, such as Rorschach, even when you have the same patient. So if I get tested using 5 different pictures, 5 different psychiatrists are going to, well, say I'm using the same pictures, same picture. 5 different psychiatrists watching me are going to find completely different information. So it's not very reliable. It also sometimes misdiagnoses and says someone has a problem when they actually don't. So validity is a problem with these as well. They're fun, what do you see in this picture, but are they reliable and valid? Not really. So what do we do with this psychoanalytic perspective? Freud starts it, and it has a huge influence all over psychology. So modern research tells us this. Indeed, you have a personality as a child, but it's not fixed in childhood. It continues to develop. Freud kind of says, as a child, you get this personality, and it's set in stone from here on out. Modern research says, no, there's a lot more room to grow after childhood. Another thing that we know about Freud is that he underemphasized peer influence on the individual. So Freud was really interested in your relationship with your parents, right? Oedipal complex. But he didn't give much consideration to the influence of your peers, and that's potentially just as powerful as the influence of your parents, and he ignored it. Freud also looked at gender identity developing around age 5 or 6, and we now know that it probably develops earlier than that. Freud's concept of dreams was that it was based on wish fulfillment, so you got to do in your dream life what you couldn't really do in reality. Now we think that there may be other reasons for that. Those verbal slips, there's examples of them, when people say, oh, that's a Freudian slip, there's several examples in your PowerPoint. Now we know that they may not actually, it's kind of like, oh, well, that's really what you must have meant since it was a Freudian slip. You really were thinking about sex instead of this or whatever. Now we know that there are actually cognitive reasons why you might have made that slip of tongue. And it's not necessarily, aha, I have access into your unconscious. And suppressed sexuality leads to psychological disorders. Sexual inhibition has decreased, but psychological disorders have not. So what does that mean? Freud basically said that any psychological problem, depression, anxiety, bipolar, anything was linked to suppressed sexuality. Now that in general society has much less suppressed sexuality, if Freud was right, we would assume that psychological disorders would decrease, but in fact they haven't. So Freud's basic theory rests on this idea of repressing painful experiences into your unconscious. We do know that a lot of people that have experienced trauma are actually unable to repress their memories. So it's like they can't forget. It keeps reoccurring in their mind over and over again. So repression actually doesn't work then. So we also know that research shows non-conscious information processing. So what this means is that you can see in your PowerPoint, schemas automatically control perception and interpretations. If you have an expected schema of how something you think is going to go, that's going to affect how you see things. We also know that the right hemisphere enables the split brain patient's left hand to carry out an instruction that the patient can't verbalize, so there's something going on that's non-conscious. We know about parallel processing, implicit memories. We know that emotions will actively activate instantly without consciousness. So you can suddenly have an emotion without having processed it consciously. And we know that self-concept and stereotypes do exist. So Freud wasn't completely off. He has been criticized, and rightly so. Psychoanalysis isn't testable necessarily well, but there may be something to it. So it's not all thrown out, and a lot of psychoanalysis is based on Freud's work still today. So The Good and Bad of Freud. We'll continue on the next video.